what's clear is that the industrial food model that the previous speaker, many of the speakers referred to here in terms of the type of food that's being produced, is under extreme stress due to climate changes. And that industrial model, by the way, has been based on a very fundamental principle. There are a number of different principles, but I'll just identify one because it's worth keeping in mind, and we'll get into the response. Has been built on a very rapid and accelerating process of concentration of control over the industry that produces the inputs that are essential to the industrial agriculture model. So how many companies do you think now control more than 50% of all commercially traded seeds? Well, almost. You're in the right ballpark. 4. Thank you, sir, with the man. Sorry, yes. Person with the crazy, that funny hat. Thank you. Yes, 4 companies. And of course, they are probably companies you're familiar with: DuPont, Dow, Syngenta, Chem China, Bayer, and Monsanto. And of course, when and if Bayer and Monsanto merge, you'll have 3. So those companies, now what's also the common thread between all 4 of those companies? Thank you, they're chemical companies. So yes, this is central to this idea of where we stand now. Essentially, you have 4 companies that are rooted in producing agricultural chemicals that are now the main producers of seeds in the world. Let that just sink in for 1 minute, because this is the system that we have here. So we have a food system that's literally been based on creating. I asked a representative of Monsanto to essentially describe to me the process by which the company is developing new seeds to deal with the volatility related to climate change. And her sentence was actually very revealing, I thought. She told me that, this is a quote now, quote, "We work to uncouple the farm from the environment around it." That was pretty clear. That was what's that? The quote is, "We work to uncouple the farm from the environment around it." It will be in the book when it comes out in June. But that is essentially her description of encapsulating essentially the company's approach. And I thought that was a very interesting way to describe this. Number one, it's extremely accurate. It is very, very accurate. And 2, and we can't forget this, it's actually been very effective. Been very effective to actually take the seed out of the environment in which it evolves and actually create an environment based on a combination of forces, including using chemical protections to protect a plant against pests, against fungus, against diseases in a particular setting, no matter where it is. You can produce and 2, genetically manipulate the plant, none of which have to do with the environment in which a seed is growing. So now you have, as a result of 4 companies dominating the seed business, what's also important to remember about what that means is that as those companies have evolved, and it's been about a 20-year process, they've basically been buying out a lot of local seed companies and taking out of commission local seed varieties that evolved in a particular ecological zones, and replace them with these seeds that can be bred over large areas of land, and replace with chemicals the characteristics of seeds that might have been able to evolve in particular conditions. So that is the situation right now with the seed business with the people who grow our food. I kept driving, actually, out of Tucson, and when I was there in Arizona. And I went down to about 2 hours south of Tucson, and I went to a farm of a person who's one of the world's experts in desert agriculture. His name was Gary Nabhan, and some of you might be familiar with his work. He's been a visionary when it comes to desert agriculture. Of course, nobody was paying attention to desert agriculture unless you lived in, like, Oman or something, until like 10 years ago when everybody realized, oh my God, the desert is coming for us, which it is. Not yet Long Island, but who knows. So he's suddenly getting a lot of attention in his life and in his work. And Gary Nabhan has a farm down in southern Arizona where he is growing nothing but sort of indigenously grown seeds. He's got a whole array of crops that he's growing. He got money from the USDA to go do some experiments in these extremely hot conditions, because the USDA itself was actually interested in what kind of crops would survive in these kind of changing conditions. And what Nabhan's found, number one, is there are a whole array of crops that can adapt to these conditions. Number two, they're all evolved in those particular areas that he's talking about. And so one of the things that's happened is we need to pay our respects to the people who've come before us, because what they're realizing in Arizona and around this country and around the world is that there's been renewed attention on native agriculture. Because let's not forget, native people were here in the United States long before we were, and they were growing food long before we were. And one of the reasons that's so important now, aside from just the historical principle of this recognition, which is long overdue, is that they have seeds that have evolved over thousands of years to deal in the Southwest with the particular conditions that are now common. So if you're growing food for 1,000 years in the Southwest, this is the oldest domesticated agriculture in America, is in the American Southwest, New Mexico and Arizona. Many of those seeds have evolved the characteristics that are needed to actually deal with this very, very, very stressful situation. So it's an extraordinarily eye-opening period for people's appreciation and knowledge of what's known as native agriculture. And that is basically happening in this country, and it's happening around the world. At the same time, you have new grains that are actually being studied in the Midwest, for example, to see grains that actually evolved in the Great Plains, in the American Midwest, that were here before the big companies replaced the local grains with the commercialized wheat varieties, which I think some of the discussion here is about some response of the gut to these kind of commercialized wheat varieties, the rise in gluten intolerance, et cetera, et cetera. And many of these things like quinoa and kamut and other grains are starting to come out of the Midwest, which, number one, are more resilient to the changes in these regions, and number two, are healthier, because they're not the same kind of processed foods that actually can trigger allergic reactions and other reactions that may be related to the food that we are eating. So you have this convergence of health and seeds together. And it's even gotten to the point where even the companies like General Mills and Kellogg's and other companies like that are beginning to see problems with the supply chain of the cereals and grains that they've been accustomed to using, and are beginning to change even their kind of mass-produced products to include some of these other grains that have been showing greater resilience. So what the ultimate growing knowledge is that in order to have seeds that are much more responsive to the conditions that we all face, number one, you need a diversity of seeds. You need, and why is one of the reasons they're finding diversity is important is because in the face of these sort of volatile weather conditions, they found over and over and over again, this is scientific study after scientific study, the farms that are far more resilient to these dramatic changes are the farms that have a diverse variety of seeds. So not only is diversity good for your own health, but it's actually good for our agricultural system to have a multiple different varieties of seeds. So we need multiple varieties. Let me tell you one more story, which hopefully illustrates this point. Well, if it's not clear yet, the model that I'm kind of laying out runs counter to the model that we currently have, which is dominated by the industrial food companies. And let me give you one other example, which I think is very dramatic. Now just shift gears here for a minute. Close your eyes for half a second and imagine the city, which I'm sure you've read about, of Aleppo, Syria. And Aleppo, Syria, as you know, Syria has been going through a tragedy, deep tragedy over the past 7 years of fighting. One of the things that has been lost is this, that in the city of Aleppo, which has always been a center of agricultural research, there was a seed bank. And that seed bank grew some of the most important crops that's throughout the Middle East and North Africa, very important food crops, bulgur and wheats and barleys and multiple fruits adapted to desert conditions. The rebels in Syria took over that seed bank and protected it. And because the commander, and I was told this by somebody who worked at the seed bank, because he was a farmer and he understood how important it was to maintain diversity in seeds. And many of the seeds he planted, he understood how important it was. Even at some of the worst days of the siege of Aleppo, the rebels agreed to keep the diesel engine running that would actually keep the refrigerator cold so that they could keep those seeds alive and vibrant. And that seed bank, which is affiliated with the United Nations, and its technical name is the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas, ICARDA. And of course, the world is starting to pay a lot more attention to dry areas and to those seeds in Syria. Well, about a year ago, it was maybe 18 months ago, the attacks started intensifying. I'm sorry, it was about a year and 3 months ago. The attacks started intensifying on Aleppo, and the people who ran the seed bank, including the rebels who were protecting it, were first forced to flee, and then all the scientists who were working there, who came from around the world, by the way, were forced to flee. And scientists right across the border in Lebanon agreed to get those seeds and spirit them. They got the one highway, they got clearance to go on the one highway darting out of Syria and into Lebanon. And they took a van filled with boxes of seeds, and they threw them in the back of the van. They raced that train. They had to go to checkpoints from both the government. They had to go through rebel checkpoints, whatever was left, the government checkpoints, and Hezbollah checkpoints, because Hezbollah runs eastern Lebanon, and raced that van right across the border into Lebanon. And here was this incredible collection of seeds that came straight out of Aleppo, have now been planted in Lebanon, in eastern Lebanon. Hezbollah has agreed to protect this farm because Hezbollah controls eastern Lebanon. I haven't been there. It's hard to get into, but that's what I hear. I've talked to the scientists by Skype who runs this institution. And they've also taken him as backup to Morocco. So in Morocco, which is roughly similar climate to Lebanon, and in eastern Lebanon, you have growing the seeds of Syria. Now, why are these seeds so important? Well, do you remember from your high school geography classes, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers? Yeah. So what happened in the Tigris-Euphrates River? Well, dried up, yes. This woman's dried up. She's unfortunately correct to a significant extent. But going further back, of course, this was the seat of domesticated agriculture. This is when agriculture began. This is when humankind basically started to figure out they could take seeds, drop them in the ground, add a little water, let a little sunshine come in, and boom, up comes food. So suddenly humans could stop wandering around. They could stop wandering around looking for animals to hunt or berries to pluck off a berry somewhere. And they could plant things, stay put. That's why some of the most ancient civilizations on Earth come from this Middle Eastern area. And so into this area, Aleppo is based in the middle of the Tigris-Euphrates. It's not literally on the Tigris-Euphrates, but that whole kind of fertile, it's called the Fertile Crescent. Remember the Fertile Crescent? Good. Yes, the Fertile Crescent is the seat of domesticated agriculture. And so those seeds now have adapted to the condition. They've had thousands of years to adapt. They've adapted to conditions that resemble what? Arizona, Midwest, different parts of the United States, different parts of the world. And so a quick understanding of what's happened to those seeds in addition to Lebanon, Morocco, shipments of those seeds been sent to Kansas. You remember Kansas where they're having the larvae problem with the wheat? Well, they've been taking these Syrian seeds. They've been doing this incredible series of experiments where they're actually testing the which seeds are the most resilient to these conditions. They're literally setting up. They have a greenhouse. They put the seedlings in a greenhouse. They let in a horde of these fruit flies, and they see which survive. And over and over and over again, the highest rates of survival by far are the Syrian seeds. Could end up being the Syrian seeds coming from Aleppo are going to save the American wheat harvest and save the neck of a lot of Kansas farmers. And there's a similar thing happening in the Dakotas where you've had, what happens when it gets hot and then you get a sudden downpour, one of these intense downpours? Fungus love to attack wheat right after a rainstorm heat. They're also bringing these Syrian seeds into the Dakotas. So if you need an example of why diversity of elements are important in this extremely charged time, those are pretty powerful examples. So quickly, this is part of the struggle. My talk is about the struggle for our food. This is part of the struggle that people all over the world are having to maintain a hold on the seeds that have been grown up in different regions because they show that they perform, they're able to adapt, and people can and in many ways they are a far more steady and stable source of food than the industrial varieties we've counted on. There are now seed exchanges in different parts of the United States. I visited some seed libraries, and I'm sure you have some here in Long Island, where people are saving. I walked into a library in Richmond, California, which is not far from me in Richmond, and they basically took those old card catalogs, God bless them, from the days when card catalogs were in paper little tags, and old wooden card catalogs, which have been stuck in a back room for years when the libraries went digital, took those out and started dropping seeds into them. And farmers can now come in, deposit one seed, take out another seed, agree to bring something back in the following season with notes about how the seeds perform. This is happening all across. There are 400 of these seed libraries now across America. There are major efforts to try out with these new crops that are actually independently produced. There have actually been dozens of new small or seed companies, each within regions, Here in the Hudson Valley, you have amazing kind of seed companies coming up along here, this very rich area along the Hudson Valley. And the Southeast and different parts of California and different parts of the Southwest, you have these kind of libraries and seed exchanges that are beginning to actually put up resistance to the kind of domination of this industry by these 4 companies. Essentially, to encapsulate the struggle, we have a time period of extreme volatility, high uncertainty, which are precisely the conditions which run counter to an industry of 4 companies that demands predictability. If you're a company and you're a massive global company and you're producing seeds for large quantities of land, over large areas of land, you need predictability because it costs a huge amount of money to develop those seeds and then back them up with all your chemicals and everything. So at a very time when we have the least predictability we've had, at least in recorded history, high volatility, we have a domination by 4 companies which require these very conditions. And so in a sense, when you think about the resistance that's emerging, and we think about the foods that people are talking about here, and the way that farming is done, just keep in mind that that is essentially the struggle that's going on. I like to think of all these people, and including yourselves possibly, as the kind of seed rebels of our time. So with that, I hope I give you some kind of taste of the dynamic out there, the connection of all 3 of these topics of chemicals, climate change, seeds. And thank you. I'd be glad to take questions. And I have some books. Thank you.